So here I've got Azure Active Directory, and if you're not familiar with how to access Azure AD, what you do is you log into office.com and you come into your Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Down underneath Admin Centers, you can access Azure Active Directory right there, and it will drop you out to the Azure AD dashboard. Now, what I'm demoing here is I'm actually going to show you how to create a new policy in conditional access, which I mentioned earlier is that service in Azure AD that provides a little bit more granular control over how users access resources inside of your cloud environment. So you can access the conditional access settings by going to Enterprise Applications, Conditional Access. Alternatively, you can also access conditional access in Endpoint Manager by going to Enterprise Endpoint Security, and you'll see conditional access down here as well. So depending on which tool you're in, you can access it in both places. I'm used to accessing it through Azure AD, so I'm going to do so here. So here you can see that we've got a couple of baseline policies created. One thing I noticed when I was working on this demo was that these policies are deprecated and no longer being enforced. So even though you might see these baseline policies here, disregard them. Excuse me. Now, in order to create a new policy, we click on New Policy. And again, the whole point of this tool is to more granularly define how our users access information inside of Azure, inside of Microsoft 365, right? So in my demo environment, I've only got a couple of users here, but you'll be able to see how this process works. So I'm going to name my policy just test policy. And then we have to assign this to users or groups. It could be all users, none. We could select users and groups. The one thing I like about this tool is if you're setting up a policy that could potentially lock you out, it kind of notifies you. So you see here, don't lock yourself out. So the tool does a good job of making sure you don't shoot yourself in the foot, which is kind of nice. So in this case, for my demo purposes, we're going to go and select users and groups. And we're going to pick on my wife. I put a test user account for my wife in here. So I know that she's got Mac OS and she runs an iPhone. And, let's say I want to make sure that when she's logging into this tenant with her iPhone or her Mac, there's a little bit more of a security presence during that login process. So that's what we're going to do here. So I selected her as, the target of this policy. Now, what do we want to target? So what do we want to, when she's accessing, what resource do we want this policy to apply? Do we want it to be all cloud apps? Do we want it to be select apps? One question I commonly get is the user action here. Why would you select this? So what this is when you're registering multi-factor authentication information, that's what this policy does. So for example, if I wanted to make sure that my users were on a network that I trust, and only at that location can they register multi-factor authentication information, that's what this option here is for. So most cases, you're not going to use that unless you're turning on MFA for the first time. But we're going to stick with cloud apps for this option. So I can do all cloud apps. And again, it's going to yell at me, don't lock yourself out, or you can select individual apps. You'll also see third-party applications that are tied to your tenant in here as well. For example, Altera Office 365 Backup. So for this purpose, whenever my wife uses an Office application, I want her to take an additional step during the login process. So that's why I'm going to select Office 365. So from there, I'm going to click Done. And under what conditions will this happen? So there's a number of different things. We've got the option for sign-in risk. And a common question I get here is, well, yeah, we can do sign-in risk, but what does high mean? What does low mean? What does medium mean? It doesn't really call that out here. And really what it is it's kind of a matrix of different things that kind of raises the score. Did you log in, on the other side of the world 5 minutes ago? That's kind of like a high security risk. Did you log in at 2 different places at the same time? That's a high security risk. Are you logging in from a strange IP address? That kind of raises the bar a little bit too. So there's a whole list of behind-the-scenes stuff that falls into that risk level. Device platform. So if we want to make this policy occur on only certain devices, we can do that. So like I mentioned earlier, my wife, she uses iOS, she uses Mac OS. So we're going to select those 2 platforms. Locations. So the big thing here is, you can specify a trusted IP range. So for example, in those corporate offices where you've got a static IP address, and the most common use case I've seen for this is in the case of multi-factor authentication. The most common thing I see is organizations will configure conditional access to not prompt for multi-factor authentication when the user is within the office, within that specified IP range. So kind of you're assuming that the office is a trusted location, therefore they don't have to take the extra steps of doing multi-factor authentication. I'm going to disregard that for right now. Client apps. This is in preview. If you want a conditional access policy to apply to things like browsers and mobile apps, you can do so. What this really does is kind of controls access to corporate data. So your Office.com apps, basically. You can make it so access is only allowed from a managed browser. Like for example, on an iOS device, if you wanted to make it so Safari couldn't access those web-based apps, you could do that here. You could make it so they would have to download Edge on the iPhone in order to access those company applications. And then device state. Basically, you can do a couple of interesting things here. You can include all device states, but what's really interesting here is you can actually exclude certain devices from this policy using this if you wanted to. For example, if the device is hybrid Azure AD joined, meaning it exists in an on-premises Active Directory environment somewhere, you could exclude that from this policy, or if the device is marked as compliant inside of Microsoft Intune. Those are two other options that you can do to kind of facilitate exactly how you want this policy to work. And then from there, we've got our access controls. You can block access based on these conditions. You can grant access, but require a few additional things. You can require that MFA is prompted in that situation, or that the device be marked as compliant. You can require that the device be Azure AD joined. You can require that it's an approved client app, or an app protection policy. A lot of different stuff that you can select in here. Again, it's all about finely controlling how people log in and use their information, access their information. Now, you have the option of turning the policy on or off. What I find really interesting is you can make this policy report only. So in the situations where you're like, what would happen if this policy was enabled, you can get a report and conditional access will tell you how it would enable across your infrastructure. Now I'm going to close this. There's one other thing I want to show you really quick, kind of back to the what would happen under a certain situation. That's also kind of what this what if button does. You can see how certain conditional access policies will affect certain users in certain situations. That's what this whole tool here does. So really powerful as you start setting up conditional access inside of your environment.